everybody, welcome back to the Tradesman channel. Tonight we're doing a straight up, no bullshit, no music, no fancy cut and editing, things like that we normally do. This is just a straight up down and dirty tutorial video on soldering. You guys watched me a while ago. We were doing a boiler installation at my job and I happened to run the camera and we got some footage of me soldering some 3-inch copper pipe. And I mentioned at the end of that one that maybe we do a quick soldering tutorial video, and today is that day because it's been a busy week this week. The kids play baseball, so we've been going with that all week, stuff like that. So the video output's a little bit slow. So I had a little time tonight after the game. Figured we'd get into this. So get into a few things. There's a few reasons that people fail miserably at soldering pipe. The first reason, and I did it a lot myself when I first started out doing this, was getting the pipe too hot. If you get the pipe too hot, you don't have to get solder joints cherry red. If you get them too hot, you end up burning the flux out of it, then the solder doesn't take, and believe it or not, that fitting will probably never take solder after that. I've run into that a lot over the years. The other part of the other reason people fail quite a bit is they don't get the pipes clean enough. They don't. Sometimes they'll get brand new fittings right out of the box and they'll see that the copper looks shiny on the inside. Still has to be clean. There still is a layer of oxidation on there that you need to get off of there. So when you clean it, it should be a nice bright, just like this, nice bright and shiny. So what we're going to do, now this piece here, I'm going to be building a lumber drying kiln in here at some point. I actually have a little tiny boiler for it. So I figure if I'm going to do a solder tutorial, I can't talk tonight. If I'm going to do a tutorial video on soldering, I might as well make something that I can use later on down the road so we don't waste a bunch of fittings, because stuff does cost money. Now the setup I use when I am soldering pipes, a lot of times I use an MC tank like this. It's an acetylene tank. It's like a tiny B tank. I like to use a turbo torch. They are expensive, but if you're going to be doing a lot of soldering, they're worth every bit. And I use a number 3 tip for most of my soldering needs. Sometimes if I'm getting into huge pipe, yeah, we'll go up to a number 5 or number 8, something like that. But for most of what I do, and pretty much anything you'd ever need to do soldering wise, a number 3 tip works just fine. Also, you want to make sure, especially by building codes today, if you're using solder, I've got a lead-free 95.5 solder here. That's a standard solder you can get any HVAC plumbing supply house, even Lowe's and Home Depot. And I use Harris Stay Clean soldering paste flux. Works very well. You still have to wipe it off. Any flux you use, you want to wipe it off afterwards so that you don't get the green corrosion. You ever go into a place, everything was soldered up a few years before, and you look at where every solder joint is and you have a layer of green powdery corrosion on the pipe. A lot of times that's because they did not clean the flux off after they did it. So that's the basics of what you need. You know, of course you obviously you're going to want decent pipe cutters. The Lennox ones like I have here usually aren't the greatest, but if you keep a good sharp wheel on them, they do just fine. I've noticed with any pipe cutter, as soon as that wheel starts getting a little dull, it leaves a ridge on the pipe and it's damn near impossible to get the fittings on it. So that's the basics of what you need. Obviously some sand cloth, and the big thing, a dry rag so you can wipe the joints off while they're still hot. Fitting brushes are handy for most of your residential applications. This is really all you need. It'll have a 3/4 and a 1/2 inch fitting brush on each end, and then it'll have the 3/4 and 1/2 inch for sand or for brushing the outside of the pipe, because you want that pipe really clean. So anyway, let's get to the secrets of soldering success. So what I like to do, I'll start by fluxing. Obviously flux is the first thing after everything's clean. You guys can see this pipe's nice and clean. I have my fitting nice and clean. I don't know if you could see, let's see if we can catch the light. A little bit, but the fittings are also nice and clean. So say I have a couple of fittings to do on the same piece. So I have this T, and I know we're going to be putting 2 fittings in each of them. or 2 pieces of pipe, I will go ahead and flux whatever I'm going to be doing. You don't want to leave flux on your fittings for an extended amount of time, because then that makes it so it doesn't take very well that way. Make sure your fitting brush is clean, everything's clean. And a lot of people also put a ton of flux on the fittings. You only need a thin layer. And the reason I say that, when you end up getting a bunch of flux down inside what you're working on, the stuff actually ends up in everything. And if you don't have a pipe vise, and you don't have a bench vise with a pipe holder in it, and you want to build something before you installed it, a heavy block of wood and a 2-hole strap works really well. Just a little trick there. So I'm not really measuring anything because I don't really care. Now you see how dirty this pipe is. This $3 or $4 fitting brush here works quite well for cleaning that stuff up. You can see that, but it gets it just about perfect. So we've already fluxed. We fluxed that guy already. Sometimes you get a fitting that's a little bit out of whack, so it'll be a little difficult to put together. Or sometimes your cutters will have put a rolled edge, like this one up here. It's got a little bit of a rolled edge. We may end up trimming that down. Alright. Before we fire up the torch, we know we're fluxed, we know we're clean. I like to get my solder ready. And all I do is just spool it out a little bit, put a little bit of a hook on it, because that way when you're running the torch, you have that hook, you can keep your hand right out of the way of that. Now when you're heating fittings up, another mistake people make is sometimes they'll sweat the top fitting first, then they'll go to sweat the bottom, and they'll actually end up sucking the solder out of that top fitting. So I always start at the bottom and work my way up. Now let's see if we can do this. Let's turn the torch on first. Remember that solder is going to go where the heat is. So it's nice when you have one end open, you can actually look in the end and see if your solder penetrated the entire joint. Now you notice I don't move the solder around a ton. That's because solder will actually follow the heat. So wherever you put that heat, once you get it at melting temperature, it will actually, that solder will follow it right around. And what that does is that really helps you get a clean joint where you don't have solder blobs all over the place. And the other thing is if you have solder that starts running out the sides of the fitting, you've put too much solder in it. Okay, see if we can get you a close-up shot here. Now again, this part's fluxed, ready to go. It's all cleaned, ready to go. So let's solder this one now. If you're just learning how to solder, you're trying to figure it all out, it helps sometimes, especially if you're in a tight spot, and we're going to demonstrate that. I have a piece of drywall behind us. I'm going to demonstrate soldering up really tight to drywall without burning the drywall. And that's where torches like this come in handy over like your standard blowtorch. It just has a huge tip, a really big flame. It can be really problematic when you're soldering in tight spots, but these shine with stuff like that. But if you're in a tight spot, sometimes it helps to kind of take a couple practice swipes around that pipe before you even turn the pipe on, or the torch on, to make sure that you can clear with your torch where you need to get to. And like I said, the solder is going to follow the heat, so keep that in mind when you're sweating pipe. So let's do this one. We'll do the easy ones to get to. Then the next one we're going to do is going to be a upside down joint that's tight to a wall, and you're trying not to burn the place down. That'll be the next one here. All done. Now while the solder's hot, everything's still hot, you take a dry rag, you wipe it down. That's how you get a nice clean solder joint when you're all said and done. Now you guys notice how briefly I had that solder on there and how fast it actually takes when you have the heat right on the pipe. That's kind of the big secret to it. You fill the joint up nicely, but you do it fast. I do not like overheating fittings. It is no good for anybody. So the next one we're going to do uptight to the drywall, upside down. We're just going to have fun with it. Alright, so we have this joint here about an inch away from paper on the drywall. And this is about the best way I guess I can demonstrate upside down in a tight space. Sometimes you're going to be under a sink cabinet laying on your back. Fortunately, I don't do a lot of plumbing. I do most of this when I'm doing boiler work, installing headers and things like that. But again, where I showed you a moment ago, before I even light this torch up, I'm going to take a little bit of a practice run right here and see where I can get my torch in there without melting the solder, or excuse me, setting the drywall paper on fire. Getting late, getting tired. So remember, so if you're so the solder melting point is like 464 degrees Fahrenheit, something like that, for 95.5. Brazing rod flow point is more around 1500 degrees. So it gives you an idea. At 464 degrees, you are not getting this pipe cherry red. And like I said earlier, the hotter you get that pipe above what you need it, the more likely it is you're just going to burn the flux and the solder out, and you're going to have a leaking joint. That is one of the biggest, that's probably the biggest mistake I see a lot of people learning how to do this do. They get the pipe way too hot, and they end up burning out the solder and the flux, and then they get pinhole leaks, or they get real big voids where that solder just didn't take. Remember, you want to fill the whole joint. That's the strength of that joint, is it's filled. So let's see if we can do this without, we want to try to do this without putting any brown marks on the drywall paper. We want to try to do it without getting any runs in the solder, which that's hard to do sometimes when you're upside down in tight spaces, but we're going to do the best we can. Hopefully I didn't get the torch too close to the camera. So I did get a little run there, but we wiped it down with a dry rag when it was hot. And if you're like me and it drives you nuts to have runny solder joints, I'll show you what we can do once you have it nice and thin. But let's pull this back, see if we have any marks on that drywall at all. Nothing. No brown marks, none of that. That's what we want. So let's inspect these joints away from here so we can see them a little better. See what happens. Alright, so in review, we showed you how to solder. That's really all there is to it. It's not terribly hard. It's not rocket science. It just takes a little practice. Well, I recommend doing it if you can get some scrap pieces and some fittings you don't care about too much. It's not a bad idea to take them, clean them up. Leave one fitting end open. I'll show you what I mean. So say you have a T or a coupling around that you can use and you want to see how well you're soldering, because the whole point is you want to fill that entire joint space. So leave one end open, leave the pipe off of it, and work that solder until you see it just barely where you can see it on the end of the fitting. The idea is it's really easy to feed too much solder into a fitting, and then I've seen people actually fill pipes with solder before, then it breaks off, gets in screens, gets in pumps. It's no good for anybody. So less is more, but you got to have enough. So it's not a bad idea to take some practice around there. Remember, if you have solder start running out the joints and dripping, you've filled the joint. You have as much as that thing is going to take. Even when you're soldering upside down, you can solder upside down really easily. You just have to really take your time with it. Be careful about it. Let the heat, like I said, let the heat do the work. Let the torch move the solder around for you. If you're going to be doing a lot of soldering, like I said, I know it is an investment. I know it's pricey. But if you guys are getting into the trades or you have to plumb your whole house and you want copper, you know, I would really recommend at least getting an MC tank set up, the little turbo torch, number 3 tip. It'll pretty much do anything residential you're ever going to need to do. I mean, I could sweat 1.5 inch pipe with that number 3 tip and fill the joints just fine. Takes a little bit longer. But I prefer less heat for things like that because it's a lot more controlled. That's the whole idea whenever you're sweating pipes or anything like that. You want as much control on it as you can. I mean, as far as pointers, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, that really is all there is to it. With my job, doing the boiler work, things like that, I can't begin to tell you how many soldering joints over the last 15 years I've actually done, but probably thousands of them if I had to guess, maybe at least thousands of them. I mean, there's some jobs where you get in and there's 500 solder joints, no exaggeration, and one boiler header. It does happen. I've had that quite a lot. I mean, I've put a lot of this stuff together, so we've done a whole lot of it. If you guys like this kind of video, you want to see more of them, let me know in the comments below. If you're new to the channel, you've never been here before, you like just about anything trades related, we cover a lot of it here, from timber framing, blacksmithing, whatever we're into, remodeling, which we have a ton of that coming up because the boss lady has spoken. And being a good husband, I do what I'm told because I don't want my nuts in a blender. So there we go. So hope you enjoyed it, everybody, and I will see you on the next one.